She was 22 years old, and by the time the last of the autumn herring boats came in, she had nowhere left in the world to lay her head. Her stepfather, Amos Ridley, had told her plainly, the morning after her mother's funeral, that a grown stepdaughter with no husband and no dowry was a burden his fishing income could no longer carry, and he gave her 3 days to find somewhere else to be. In the hem of her coat, Mercy Calloway carried $3.80, sewn in secret over 2 years of mending nets for the wives of Gull's Rest, Maine. And with it, she meant to buy herself some kind of shelter before the coastal winter came howling down. What she found, standing forsaken on a wave-battered spit of rock a mile beyond the harbor, was the old Hollis Point Lighthouse, decommissioned 9 years before, when the shipping lanes shifted, its lantern room dark, and its spiral stair choked with gull nests, sold to her for $4 by a keeper's board, eager to be free of a liability nobody wanted. Folks who watched her hand over nearly everything she owned, for a crumbling tower with no light and no company, called it the last desperate act of a girl who had nothing left to lose. They did not know that sealed inside the lantern room, wrapped and waiting for 17 years, rested a promise that would not only give Mercy Calloway a home, but would settle a debt this whole harbor town had long since stopped believing anyone intended to pay. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Mercy Calloway. If you have ever stood somewhere the world called finished and felt, against all good sense, that it still had a light left in it, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Mercy had been born Mercy Ann Foss in the winter of 1868, in a shingled cottage on the harbor road of Gull's Rest, a fishing town clinging to the rocky Maine coast, where a family's whole fortune could be made or lost on a single herring run, and where the sea was spoken of, the way other places spoke of weather, as something to be respected, bargained with, and never quite trusted. Her father, Nathaniel Foss, had been a fisherman like nearly every man in the town, but her mother, Ruth Foss, kept the family's true trade, which was mending, patching sailcloth and oiled canvas, and the heavy woolen coats the men wore against the spray. Work that demanded a particular kind of patience Mercy absorbed simply by sitting at her mother's knee through the long gray afternoons. Ruth was not a soft woman, for the coast did not raise soft women, but she was a steady one, and she taught her daughter early that a torn sail was never truly ruined, so long as someone was willing to sit with it long enough to find where the good cloth still held. Nothing out here is finished until the sea says so, her mother would tell her, turning a salt-stiffened coat over in her chapped hands. And it will surprise you, Mercy, how rarely the sea actually says so. Mercy took the lesson to heart in a way that shaped the whole of her girlhood, mending not only cloth, but broken crab traps, cracked oars, the split handles of tools other households discarded, without a second thought, developing a quiet, careful eye for the difference between something truly beyond saving and something merely unlucky enough to look that way. Her father supplemented this with stories of the sea itself, told on the porch in the blue hour after supper, and it was through these evening stories that Mercy first came to know the name of the Hollis Point Light, the tower that stood watch a mile beyond the harbor mouth, warning ships away from the wicked ledge of rock that had claimed vessels long before anyone thought to build a beacon there. Nathaniel spoke with particular reverence of the light's longtime keeper, a man named Elijah Pruitt, who had tended the lamp faithfully for nearly 2 decades, and was, by every account Mercy ever heard, among the most trusted men on that stretch of coast. A keeper who had personally rowed out in weather no sane man would risk to guide fishing boats safely past the ledge more times than the town could properly count. But her father's voice always changed when the story reached its end, growing quieter, more careful, the way a person speaks around an old wound rather than through it. For Elijah Pruitt had been dismissed from his post, under a cloud of disgrace, some 17 years before Mercy's birth, blamed for the wreck of the merchant schooner Constance Marie, on the very ledge his light was meant to guard, a disaster that had claimed 6 lives including 2 young sons of the harbor's most prominent shipping family, the Senates. Nathaniel never fully explained what he believed had actually happened that night, only that he did not think the whole truth of it had ever come properly to shore, and Mercy filed the comment away, the way she filed away every scrap of cloth, too small to use immediately, sensing without knowing why that it might matter to her one day. Life in Gull's Rest moved to the rhythm of the tides and the herring runs, and Mercy grew from a solemn, watchful child into a young woman known around the harbor for her fine, patient needlework and her steady hands. The kind of hands fishermen's wives sought out when a coat needed mending before a hard season, or a net needed reweaving before dawn. She was not given to idle talk or easy laughter, but those who came to know her found in her a dependability that mattered more, on that coast, than charm ever could, and it was this quiet reputation, more than anything else, that would come to matter enormously later, though on the ordinary days of her girlhood, she gave it no particular thought at all. Her mother died of a wasting sickness in the spring Mercy turned 20, and her father, already worn thin by decades of hard fishing, followed less than 2 years after, leaving Mercy without either parent and, because Nathaniel Foss had died owing more to the ship's chandlery than his modest estate could cover, without any inheritance beyond her mother's sewing basket and a small tin box of coins Ruth had kept hidden from even her own husband. Savings meant, Mercy understood only after her mother's death, for exactly this kind of emergency. It was Amos Ridley, a widower fisherman who had courted her mother briefly in the year before Ruth's death, and married her with what Mercy had, at the time, believed to be genuine affection, who inherited what remained of the small Foss household by right of his brief marriage. And it was Amos who made unmistakably clear, once her mother's funeral had passed and the sympathy of the neighbors had begun to thin, that he had never intended to raise a grown stepdaughter who was not his own blood and brought no dowry to ease the burden of it. He was not, in any dramatic sense, a cruel man. He simply saw Mercy as an obligation he had never agreed to, and he informed her over a cold supper, 3 days after the funeral, that she would need to find other arrangements by week's end, since the house, small as it was, could not properly support 2 adults on a single fisherman's income, particularly when one of them contributed nothing but mending work he considered easily hired out cheaper elsewhere. Mercy did not argue, for she had learned from her mother that dignity often meant leaving cleanly rather than pleading to stay where one was not truly wanted, and she packed what was unquestionably her own, the sewing basket, the hidden tin of coins, and a single framed photograph of her parents, and walked into the town proper with $3.80 to her name, and no clear notion of where she would sleep past the coming week. She spent her first nights in the loft above the ship's chandlery, offered grudgingly by a shopkeeper who had known her father, but understood within days that she could not rely on that kindness indefinitely, and so she began walking the length of the harbor each morning, looking not for charity, but for some cheap, overlooked foothold she might claim outright, however humble. It was on the 4th day of this searching, standing at the harbor's edge and gazing out toward the rocky spit, where the old Hollis Point light stood dark against the gray sky, that Mercy found herself drawn, almost without deciding to be, toward the one structure in Gull's Rest that everyone else had long since stopped considering at all. The lighthouse had stood decommissioned for 9 years, ever since a newer, automated beacon had been erected on the mainland point, and in that time, it had become, in the eyes of the town, little more than a hazard and an eyesore, its keeper's board glad enough to be rid of the modest annual expense of maintaining a structure that served no remaining purpose. Mercy rowed out to it that same afternoon, in a borrowed dory, climbing the rocks to stand before the tower's peeling white paint and rust-streaked iron door, and found herself studying its ruin the way her mother had once studied a torn sail, looking past the damage to whatever might still be salvaged from it. She returned to shore and sought out old Silas Meeker, who kept the harbor's odd bits of official business alongside his post as postmaster, and asked him plainly what might be done with a structure that stood empty and untaxed on a spit no one else wanted. He told her, not unkindly, that the keeper's board would be glad to be free of the small liability the light represented, and that if she had $4 and the nerve to live somewhere most folks still considered too remote and too haunted by old tragedy to bother with, he could have the paper drawn up by the following morning. Word traveled through Gull's Rest before evening, as it always did, in so small a harbor, and more than one neighbor shook their head at the sight of Ruth Foss's orphan daughter, spending nearly all she had on a crumbling, abandoned lighthouse, calling it, with more pity than malice, the last foolish decision of a girl too grieved and too desperate to think clearly. It felt that way to Mercy, too, some nights, as she swept 9 years of gull droppings and salt-crusted dust from the tower's narrow rooms by lantern light, and told herself only that at least the thick stone walls kept the worst of the wind at bay. The first weeks inside the lighthouse were spent in the humbling, grounding labor of making a ruin livable, and Mercy approached the work the way she approached everything, without complaint, treating the labor itself as a kind of steadying comfort against her grief. She patched what windows she could with oilcloth, swept the winding stone stair clean from the keeper's quarters, up through each narrow landing, and began, out of both curiosity and practical need, to explore the tower floor by floor, hoping to find anything of use the previous keepers might have left behind. Most of what remained was disappointing. Broken furniture, rusted tools, the ordinary detritus of an abandoned post. But when she finally climbed the last narrow stair into the lantern room itself, the glass-walled chamber at the tower's very top, where the great lamp had once turned its beam out over the black water, she found the space swept strangely, almost deliberately clean compared to the rest of the tower, as though someone, long ago, had taken particular care with this one room before leaving it for the last time. It was in running her hand along the base of the lamp's iron pedestal, feeling for the familiar looseness of old hardware she might tighten or salvage, that her fingers found a seam in the pedestal's stone base, too straight and too deliberate to be ordinary wear, a section fitted and mortared with a care that spoke of a man who had wanted something hidden but never destroyed. She worked at the loose stone for the better part of an hour, with a chisel salvaged from the tower's toolshed, until it finally came free to reveal a shallow cavity built into the pedestal itself, and inside, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff and brittle with 17 years of salt air, she found a leather logbook, its cover embossed with the initials EP, and beneath it, a bundle of letters tied with tarred cord, and beneath those, wrapped separately, a small iron strongbox, no larger than a bread loaf, its lock rusted nearly solid. Mercy sat back on her heels in the lantern room's fading light, and understood immediately, with the same instinct that had once told her which torn sails still held good cloth, that these things had been hidden here on purpose, by a keeper who had never returned to claim them. It took Mercy 3 careful evenings to work the logbook's salt-stiffened pages apart, without tearing them, and what she read there, slowly and by lamplight, unspooled a story, 17 years old, that reached back further into Gull's Rest's history than she had ever imagined her own life could touch. The logbook belonged, as its opening entries confirmed, to Elijah Pruitt, the very keeper her father had spoken of with such careful reverence, and it recorded, in a keeper's plain, disciplined hand, the daily routines of tending the Hollis Point light, through years of storms and calm alike, until abruptly, in an entry dated the autumn of 1862, the tone shifted, growing tighter and more urgent, describing Elijah's discovery that the lighthouse authority responsible for supplying his post had, for months, been quietly reducing his allotment of lamp oil below what regulation required, a cost-cutting measure ordered from a distant regional office that left the light burning weaker and shorter through the long autumn nights than any keeper's manual permitted, a danger Elijah had written to the authority about repeatedly, warning that a light too dim or too brief could fail a ship on a night when it mattered most. The letters, when Mercy untied them, filled in what the logbook only implied. They were written by Elijah to his wife, Constance, though whether they had ever been sent or were drafts he kept for himself, Mercy could not say, and in them he described his mounting dread that the authorities' cost-cutting would eventually cost a ship, and his growing certainty that the regional supervisor overseeing the reduction, a man named Cornelius Bray, cared more for the modest savings it reflected in his ledgers than for the vessels that passed the ledge each night. On the night the merchant schooner Constance Marie struck the rocks and went down with 6 souls aboard, including the 2 young Sennett brothers, the light had indeed burned low, precisely as Elijah had warned it would, But rather than acknowledge the authorities' own negligence, Cornelius Bray had moved swiftly to lay the blame entirely at the keeper's feet, claiming in the official inquiry that Elijah had been derelict in his duties and had allowed the lamp to run dry through simple carelessness, a charge Elijah could not disprove without producing his own correspondence. Correspondence Bray had made certain, through his authority over the regional office's files, never reached the inquiry board at all. The final letter in the bundle, dated only days before the logbook's entries stopped altogether, described Elijah's plan to preserve his own copies of the warnings he had sent, along with a portion of his keeper's wages he had managed to set aside, hidden safely where Bray's men, who had already searched his quarters once, under pretense of official business, would never think to look, trusting he would find some way to clear his name once the shock of the tragedy had passed. He never did. The logbook's final entry, in a hastier hand that was not quite Elijah's own, recorded only that Elijah Pruitt had been dismissed from his post within the month and had left Gull's Rest with his wife before the year was out, his name synonymous, from that day forward, with a disaster the town believed entirely his fault. Mercy sat with this discovery for a long while before she understood its full weight, turning back through the logbook's careful entries and Elijah's increasingly desperate letters until the shape of it became unmistakable to her. A man who had done everything within his power to prevent a tragedy had been made to carry the blame for it instead, his warnings buried by the very authority whose negligence had caused the failure, his good name quietly rewritten so thoroughly that 17 years later, not even Mercy, raised on her father's careful, half-finished stories, had ever heard the true account spoken aloud. She thought of her father's reverent, uneasy tone whenever Elijah Pruitt's name arose, and understood now that Nathaniel Foss had likely sensed some fragment of this wrongness himself, without ever having the proof to say so plainly. The iron strongbox, when she finally forced its rusted lock, revealed a modest sum of coin, carefully wrapped, along with a single folded document that made Mercy's breath catch, a promissory note, in Elijah's own hand, dated the very week of the wreck, pledging that portion of his savings, and any future wages he could spare, toward the support of the Sennett family and the other bereaved households of the Constance Marie, a debt he had never been given the chance, nor the standing, to honor, a promise the town itself had never known existed. Mercy returned to the logbook many times in the weeks that followed, drawn back to Elijah's careful hand, the way one returns to an old wound to see whether it has healed, and each reading revealed some new detail she had missed before. She found, tucked near the back of the logbook between two entries, a small pressed sprig of sea lavender gone brittle and gray with age, and beside it, in Elijah's hand, a note that read simply, "For whoever tends this light after me." So they know the lamp was never the failing, only the men who starved it of oil. It settled something in Mercy, that discovery, hardening her quiet resolve into something closer to duty. She was no longer simply defending her own claim to a crumbling tower and the coin it had hidden. She was carrying, whether she had asked for the weight or not, the unfinished promise of a man who could no longer keep it himself, and a grieving family somewhere who deserved, at the very least, to know the truth of what had taken their sons. Gull's Rest in 1890 had not forgotten the wreck of the Constance Marie, though it had long since stopped questioning its settled account, for Cornelius Bray's son, Whitmore Bray, had grown into one of the harbor's most prominent men, having taken over his father's old regional authority and expanded it into the Bray Shipping and Provisioning Company, which now held contracts supplying nearly every vessel and dock in Gull's Rest, a position of considerable influence built, Mercy now understood, on a foundation of quiet, decades-old deceit. Mercy did not go to Whitmore Bray first with what she had found, sensing correctly that a man whose family fortune rested on his father's old cover-up would not welcome its unraveling, but word of her discovery reached him regardless, carried by a well-meaning dockhand she had consulted about old shipping records. And within the week, Whitmore Bray himself rode out to the Lighthouse, polite and smiling, in a way that did not reach his eyes, offering to purchase the tower back from her for 10 times what she had paid, framing it as an act of generosity toward a poor orphaned girl who surely did not want to live alone on a wind-battered rock, when she could have real money in her pocket instead. Mercy, who had learned patience mending her mother's sailcloth, and the particular art of seeing worth where others saw only ruin, understood exactly what was being offered, and exactly what it was meant to bury, and she declined the offer, as politely as it had been made, saying only that she had grown fond of her small home, and did not wish to sell. The smile left Whitmore Bray's face at that, and what followed in the weeks after was not open hostility, for men of his standing rarely dirtied their own hands, but a slow, deliberate campaign to make Mercy's position in Gull's Rest untenable. Rumors began circulating that the girl at the old lighthouse was disturbed in her grief, imagining old scandals to justify squatting on property that rightfully belonged to progress rather than sentiment. The chandlery, quite suddenly, grew reluctant to extend her credit for lamp oil and provisions. Old Silas Meeker, who had sold her the lighthouse in good conscience, found himself abruptly informed that his postmaster's appointment was under review by the very shipping interests that funded half the harbor's commerce, and he grew noticeably cooler toward Mercy whenever she rode into the harbor afterward, torn between decency and the fear of losing his livelihood. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that leave no mark anyone could point to, but wear at a person all the same. Fishermen's wives, who had once brought her mending work, began finding reasons to take their torn nets elsewhere. Children who had once waved to her from the docks were told by careful parents to keep their distance from the strange girl living alone on the rocks, and Mercy, rowing into town for supplies, grew accustomed to conversations that stopped abruptly when she drew near and resumed, in lowered voices, once she had passed. She bore it the way she had learned to bear grief, without complaint, and without the satisfaction of anyone seeing how deeply it cut, though some nights, alone in the lantern room, with only Elijah Pruitt's careful handwriting for company, she allowed herself to wonder whether the truth was worth the isolation it seemed determined to cost her. It would have been easy, in the face of this, for Mercy to sell the logbook and letters quietly back to Whitmore Bray, for whatever price he offered, and disappear from Gull's Rest, to start over somewhere the Bray name held no power. And there were nights, huddled in the lantern room against a mounting winter wind, when she considered exactly that. But she thought of Elijah Pruitt's desperate, careful warnings, of a man who had risked his own good name trying to protect ships he would never meet. And she thought of her mother's hands turning a torn sail over and over, patient and unyielding, finding where the good cloth still held. She decided, sitting alone by lantern light, with the logbook open on her lap, that she would not let a dead man's warning stay buried, simply because the truth was inconvenient to the family that had buried it. She began, quietly and carefully, to build a case, the way her mother might have rewoven a torn sail, one deliberate stitch at a time. She sought out old Amos Kittredge, a retired harbor pilot, well into his 80s, who had guided ships past the Hollis Point ledge for decades, and who, when Mercy finally worked up the courage to show him the logbook, wept openly at the sight of Elijah Pruitt's handwriting, confirming everything the letters implied and adding details of his own, remembering how the light had indeed burned unusually dim in the weeks before the wreck, and how several pilots had quietly remarked on it at the time, remarks that had gone nowhere once the official inquiry settled on the keeper's negligence. Amos knew others too, old fishermen, and their widows scattered along the coast, men and women who still remembered a keeper they had trusted absolutely, and never quite believed capable of the carelessness he'd been accused of. Mercy wrote as well to the Regional Maritime Authority's archive in Portland, enclosing copies of the logbook's key entries and a summary of what she had found, uncertain whether any reply would come at all from an office that had shown little interest in a decommissioned light's old history. While she waited, Whitmore Bray's pressure on her only intensified. Culminating in a harbor commission meeting, Mercy was summoned to attend, ostensibly to answer questions about the lighthouse's continued occupancy, though everyone in the room understood the meeting's true purpose was to publicly discredit her into surrendering or leaving. Whitmore Bray stood before the assembled commission and townsfolk that evening, and painted Mercy as an unstable young woman, making wild accusations against an old and respected family, his voice smooth and confident, in the way of a man who had never once expected to be seriously contradicted. It was Amos Kittredge who rose first from the gathered crowd, his old voice cracking but steady, to say that he had piloted these waters since before Whitmore Bray was born, and that he remembered Elijah Pruitt as an honest man wronged, and that he would swear to it before God or anyone else who asked. He was followed by two other old harbor hands, and then, to the visible shock of the room, by a frail, silver-haired woman who rose slowly from the back benches and introduced herself, in a thin but steady voice, as Constance Sennett, the very sister of the two young men lost aboard the Constance Marie, who said she had spent 17 years believing her brothers had died because of one careless keeper, and that if there was even a chance the truth was otherwise, she wanted, more than anything left to her at her age, finally to know it. Mercy herself spoke last, laying out the logbook's entries and the corroborating testimonies with the same calm, unhurried precision she brought to every careful stitch, refusing to raise her voice even as Whitmore Bray's composure began, for the first time anyone in that room had ever witnessed, visibly to crack. The meeting ended without resolution that night, but something in Gull's Rest had shifted, the way frost shifts a dock post over a long winter, invisibly at first, and then all at once, undeniable. The Maritime Authority's reply, when it finally arrived from Portland some weeks later, came in the form of a dry, thorough investigator sent to review the old regional records alongside the evidence Mercy had assembled, and who concluded, in a formal letter delivered to the Harbor Commission, that the historical record substantially supported the claim that lamp oil allocations had been improperly reduced under Cornelius Bray's supervision, and that Elijah Pruitt's dismissal had occurred under circumstances the authority now regarded as deeply unjust. It was not a dramatic unmasking so much as a slow, official confirmation of what the coast had already begun to believe in its heart, but its effect on Whitmore Bray was immediate and severe. Ship captains, uneasy at the revelation that the family fortune underpinning Bray shipping and provisioning had been built in part on a cover-up that cost 6 lives, began quietly taking their contracts elsewhere, and the Harbor Commission, no longer inclined to defer to a man whose family's respectability had proven so thin a coat of varnish, declined to renew several of the favorable provisioning agreements that had long enriched Bray's business. He did not face criminal charges, for the wrongdoing was too old and too tangled in a dead man's absence to prosecute cleanly, but he sold his controlling interest in the company within the year, and left Gull's Rest for a harbor where the Bray name had not yet been tarnished, a quiet exile that felt, to those who had known Elijah Pruitt's story, like a fitting and sufficient justice. Mercy used the coin from the strongbox not for herself, though she could have claimed every piece of it as rightfully hers by discovery, but exactly as Elijah Pruitt had pledged 17 years before, directing it, along with a modest fund she helped organize among the harbor's grateful captains, toward the support of the Sennett family and the descendants of the other souls lost aboard the Constance Marie, the very promise Elijah had died unable to keep, and that Gull's Rest had gone 17 years without knowing it was owed. She petitioned the Maritime Authority to relight the Hollis Point beacon, under her own keeping, not as a working navigational necessity, for the automated mainland light still served that purpose, but as a memorial lamp, lit each evening in Elijah Pruitt's honor, and arranged, with Amos Kittredge's help, for a small brass plaque to be mounted at the tower's base recounting, briefly and without bitterness, the true story of the keeper who had given everything trying to protect ships that were never his to save. She kept the lighthouse, repairing it further as the seasons allowed, and it stood for years afterward at the harbor's edge, no longer a hazard nobody wanted, but something closer to a monument, a physical reminder that a light does not stop being worth tending simply because the world has decided it has gone dark. She had been 22, and utterly without a home, when she counted out $4 for a ruined lighthouse nobody else wanted, and there were those in Gull's Rest who had called it the last foolish act of a desperate girl. But Mercy Calloway had learned, first at her mother's mending basket, and then in the patient work of coaxing use from what others had discarded, that nothing left standing is ever quite as finished as it appears, that the damage in a thing is often only waiting for someone patient enough to find where the good still holds. She had not gone looking for a lost fortune or a dead man's vindication when she pried that stone free from the lantern room floor. She had been looking only for salvage to make a ruin livable, and had found instead a 17-year-old promise waiting quietly to be kept. What she restored in the end was never really about the coin, or even about her own survival, though both mattered a great deal to a girl with nearly nothing. It was about a keeper's name, buried, and then spoken again at last, before the whole harbor. It was about a grieving sister, finally allowed to know the truth of how her brothers were lost. It was about a town remembering that the quietest, most overlooked things, an old logbook, a lightless tower, an orphaned girl with a tin box of coins, sometimes carry within them everything needed to make a broken promise whole again. Thank you for spending this time with Mercy Calloway's story, and with all of us here. If this story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that hidden worth is still worth, even when the world has long since stopped looking for it. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found value in something others had already written off? A person, a place, or perhaps something as small and forgotten as an old lighthouse on a wind-battered rock. We read every story you share with us, and we are always glad to have you here. Until next time, stay close.